Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are going to continue with the theme of dissecting teams in terms of fantasy. We're going to transition from basketball to hockey. Obviously, the Boston Celtics are leading in the NBA Finals, and so too are the Florida Panthers in the Stanley Cup Finals. And let's just a deep dive on them. They are also a very weird team when it comes to fantasy. However, I do feel like in fantasy hockey, points are more viewed highly of at a premium than in the NBA, where different stats are so confusing and confounding in terms of how to truly rate a player. And so in fantasy hockey, goals, points, and assists are more valued than, say, how you're going to use a player in your fantasy squad. So this one is much more valued than, I would say, an NBA deep dive is. But I still think that dissecting both of these teams is highly important if you want to understand them better. And in the future, you want to draft players from them as well. So without further ado, let's look at a Florida Panthers squad that has had so many different contributions throughout the years. Kudos to GM Bill Zito for building a squad that is so unselfish in terms of how they play. But still, as you can see with the list I'm going to name for them, they do have guys who have been stars in this league. So let's go. Again, same thing with the Florida Panthers like I did for the Boston Celtics, just looking at the top 5 players in the top 100 of overall fantasy hockey players this time. And so without further ado, let's get right into it. Their number 1 player, a guy who I truly love as a fantasy player, Sam Reinhart. Again, only 14th in terms of overall fantasy playing, but the stats don't tell us that story. The underlying stats are truly incredible for him. He was 2nd in the league in goals. Sam Reinhart, a player who I think is truly underrated, is 2nd in the league in goals. That's an impressive prospect, but only 14th in overall fantasy rating. So that's kind of low for someone of Sam Reinhart's abilities. And it might have to do with the fact he's a Florida Panther, but still 86th in assists kind of goes against him. But overall, he was still 12th in points. That just goes to show the fact that maybe it's the aura of the Florida Panthers as a whole team that Sam Reinhart has put up those stats. 12th in the league in points, but only 14th in overall fantasy rating. In my mind's eye, he's a star of the league. Just such a dominant player, a strong physical center who can get the job done on both ends of the ice. And really, I just think it's just this enigmatic kind of mindset that people have around the Florida Panthers that might put them off the Florida Panthers bandwagon when picking their fantasy squad. But coming in at number 15 on the list and number 2 in overall Panthers in the top 5 of the top 100 is Matthew Tkachuk at 15th. This time around, I kind of don't know why he's as high. So again, another player who is very high in the rankings, but their stats don't necessarily prove that they're a good fantasy player. 74th in terms of goals, 12th though in terms of assists. So as you can see, they're kind of switcherooing between who is leading in goals and who is leading in this with Sam Reinhart and Matthew Tkachuk. Overall, 28th in points though, only 8 behind teammate Sam Reinhart. So as you can see, another player who, in terms of fantasy, the stats don't tell the whole story of who they are as a player, and maybe the team doesn't either. But coming in at number 3, obviously, in terms of fantasy basketball, you can't necessarily say this about any other position in sports. Goalies are very important, and nonetheless, and no one has been more important for their team than Sergei Bobrovsky in terms of fantasy and in real life. Only 26th overall in fantasy. That's really saying something. I think it's very high for a goalie, but he definitely deserves it. 9th in save percentage, obviously. As the playoffs go on, he's definitely heightened that statistic. Only 60th in goals against average. Didn't necessarily have the best of regular seasons, but he was 3rd in wins. So another player who had a fantastic season, one of the best goalies to have in fantasy hockey in real life. Sergei Bobrovsky between the sticks. Incredible in the postseason, probably the best postseason fantasy goalie. But again, in the regular season, I don't know what it is about the Florida Panthers. They are proving that, much like the Celtics, but unlike the Celtics, they have players who are higher ranked, and they definitely have the stats to back it up, but still are very low in terms of overall fantasy rankings. Then you have a guy, Alexander Barkov, who's 44th in overall fantasy rankings, who definitely can be viewed as the star of this team, one of the captains of this squad. However, his stats are definitely not reflective of anyone in the top 50 of overall fantasy hockey players. Only 98th in goals. He is 20th in assists and 27th in points. Now, this is a guy who I'm really weird about in terms of fantasy. Because when he's on, he's on. He can produce in terms of assists. One of the best kind of centers in this Panthers system. Probably the best Panther center if you want to go by aura alone. But still, I think that Alexander Barkov is one of the more overrated players in terms of fantasy, and that's why he's so low in the fantasy rankings. However, in terms of stats, only 7 behind Matthew Tkachuk in terms of points. So this is kind of one of those players who you kind of are not necessarily taking a flyer on, is going to be one of those players who can produce for you, but still might not tell the whole story and how people view him in fantasy. And their last player, kind of this cluster here, Verhaeghe at 49th. And he's probably one of the most even in terms of stats out of all the Panthers. 23rd in goals, 28th in assists, and 45th in points. So as you can see, one of the most steady in all stat lines. He's very similar standing in all 3 of those stats there. So the Florida Panthers, in my mind's eye, are one of those teams who, when we look at them, they definitely have more players who are higher up in the list. They're not as spread out as the Boston Celtics were. And they're definitely producing the stats to back them up in real time. So the question with the Florida Panthers is, why are they so kind of close together when in fact they are some of the better fantasy players in here? And that's the reason why I think that there really is no rhyme or reason to the Florida Panthers right now as a fantasy squad. They certainly have the best players in the NHL. There's no question about that. Maybe it's due to the fact that a lot of people view them as equals rather than one being better than the other. Take Sam Reinhart, for example. Sam Reinhart, in my opinion, is probably the second best player on this Florida Panthers squad in his day. I'll take Alexander Barkov mainly just due to name and brand and aura alone, what have you. But Sam Reinhart, in my opinion, second in terms of overall production. First in my mind if we get rid of aura and name and brand. In terms of overall fantasy, being 14th, I know that's not necessarily the worst, but I think Sam Reinhart, based off the stat, second in goals, 12th in points. Sam Reinhart, for all intents and purposes, should be a top 5 fantasy player in my mind's eye. He's a no-brainer in your squad if you want goals. Not necessarily assists, maybe that's what hurts him ultimately, but 12th in points is still outstanding. However, I think that due to the fact that the Florida Panthers just have so many players in the top 100 who are so close together, maybe that's why Sam Reinhart, who I view so highly, is not necessarily viewed as highly in fantasy. Then take a guy like Alexander Barkov, who a lot of people know about, is only 44th. And this year mainly could be one of the reasons why. He obviously was not high in goals. He was 20th in assists, only 27 in points, only 7 behind Matthew Tkachuk, who is their second-rated fantasy player on this list. So it just goes to show that discrepancies in the Florida Panthers squad might lay within the fact that people aren't necessarily uncomfortable picking with them. It's just a matter of there being too many of them to decide between. Maybe it's just because of the fact that this season for the Florida Panthers, because of their depth, so many different players were able to step up for them. Sam Reinhart being one of them. And I think so many people now really are going to start to come around to the Florida Panthers. Next year, I think that even more Florida Panthers are going to be in the top 100. Now they're getting the name brand that they truly deserve. I think that should they win their first Stanley Cup final in franchise history, the duck will be broken. People won't be necessarily shying away from them. And I think that maybe one or even two of them will break into the top 5 in terms of fantasy. Sam Reinhart will get a lot more respect because right now, this Florida Panthers team, no matter how much closer they are together than the Boston Celtics were to spread all across the map, I still don't think they're as highly valued as people want them to be. I certainly think the Florida Panthers players should be put at a premium when you view fantasy. Florida Panthers players should always be on your radar no matter what. They're not sleeper picks anymore, in my opinion. These are bona fide fantasy stars. So for next season, I'll be really intrigued to see if more players from this loaded Panthers squad break into the top 15, top 20 at the very least, because I just don't think this team is reflected in how well they play in fantasy and in the stats that I see on paper. Whereas the Boston Celtics, obviously, I just think there's so many different players across this list that you have to kind of spread them across the map in terms of fantasy. But these two teams, they were very nice to talk about due to the fact that they were kind of similar, but then also kind of drastically different in their own ways. There's a lot of diversity within how we view them in fantasy. So it's very nice to talk about these two teams. But coming up next should be a fantastic segment. The Euros make their triumphant return, as for the first time ever in the history of the show, I will be reviewing a team in terms of their fantasy implications for the Euros, and it should be a good one. It is England, the Three Lions on a shirt, who I will be previewing first for my Euros fantasy previews. You do not want to miss this segment. Should be an absolute cracker. Who will be right back to end the show with that. Stick around, please.